Yes, indeed. And we will be eyeing and updating you on all of this updates. Thank you very much, Dr. Alwhite, for joining us and sharing that insight throughout this topic. Now we move on. A major Russian attack on central Kyiv has triggered a fire in a high-rise apartment building and targeted energy sites, cutting powers to parts of the capital. Kyiv Mayor Vitali Klitschko has said that 9 people have been injured, with 5 of them taken to hospital. He has also added that power cuts and disruption to the water supply have hit districts on the east bank of the Dnipro River that runs through the city. The Russian strikes has also killed a 7-year-old child in the southeast Ukraine. Meanwhile, the energy minister Vitali has said that Russian forces have hit energy sites. She further stated that energy experts are taking necessary measures to minimize negative consequences. Meanwhile, the U.S. President Donald Trump has said that the United States and NATO allies are stepping up the pressure to end the war in Ukraine after his outreach to Russian President Vladimir Putin failed to materialize any ceasefire. Let's listen into what President Trump has said.
We are stepping up the pressure. We're stepping it up together. We're all stepping it up. NATO's been great.
Now for this discussion, we're joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you very much, Ross, for joining us again. Good to see you. Ross, now from your analysis, how do you see Russia and U.S.'s relationship?
At the moment, obviously, President Trump has been focused on mediating between Hamas and Israel, but it's certainly very possible that he will turn his attention back to the war in Russia and Ukraine. And he might very well repeat some of the criticisms that's become more frequent when he speaks about this issue, specifically criticisms about President Putin. And that was a bit of a change from what President Trump used to say earlier this year after he returned to office. That being said, I think President Trump is still eager to bring the two sides together in a deal that would basically freeze the front line where it is now. There was the remark that Trump made about Russia not being able to win the war and the advantage is with Ukraine, and that very well might be possible. But as I previously said here on NewsX, I don't think President Trump is giving Ukraine a green light to launch a major counteroffensive. So we're kind of still where we are, I think, from around the time that Putin met with President Trump in Alaska, which is President Trump wants the two sides to quickly reach an agreement that would basically freeze the front line where it is.
And now you've also mentioned that President Trump is focused on mediating between Gaza and Hamas and Israel. So since this outcome between Hamas and Israel was also reached because the world stood up, a lot of people around the globe stood up asking for a negotiation or asking for pause in the halting in this situation in Gaza. Do you think if the world stands up united again for this Ukraine and Russia, do you think that there is possibility that ceasefire could be reached between them?
That's an interesting question. I actually would take the view that it's President Trump himself and his own pressure on Netanyahu that may have prompted some movement on the Israeli side. Clearly, Israel and Netanyahu throughout the war have been fairly resistant to international criticism and international pressure. And also, frankly, Israel has largely achieved its military goals, not entirely. They didn't recover all the hostages on their own and had to reach this ceasefire agreement in order to do so, but they've largely militarily defeated Hamas. So it could be simply that the timing was right for Israel to reach this deal as well. Now, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, the situation is certainly distinguished. European countries have been very united, with some exceptions, but for the most part, and especially the major countries like France, Germany, and the UK, they've been very united in their support for Ukraine. They've been very united in continuing to impose additional rounds of sanctions on Russia. On the other side, Russia has continued the war. It has its support economically and politically from certain countries, most notably China, and to a lesser extent, certainly economically from India. So the view from around the world doesn't seem to have an effect on how the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, are approaching the war or approaching ceasefire talks. Now, of course, both countries have significant incentives to stop the war. The economic cost, the cost in human lives, is tremendous. Russia wants some of the international sanctions removed as well. So both sides, again, they also have incentive to reach an agreement. But similar to Israel and Hamas, the main player here is not going to be Europe or Asia or the Middle East. It's going to be the United States.
Thank you, Ross, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on to North America. A federal judge has temporarily halted President Donald Trump's deployment of the Texas National Guard to Chicago, rejecting claims of a danger of rebellion that would justify the move. The restraining order issued by District Judge April Perry will last about 2 weeks as legal challenges continue. Let's listen into what Attorney General Kwame Raoul has said.
Judge Perry did a very careful job of weighing the evidence, weighing the credibility of the evidence and those declarations that served as the testimony to be considered as to whether or not the President of the United States could and should federalize and deploy the National Guard into our great city and our great state. And I think after doing so, she made the correct decision to enter a temporary restraining order.
Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has announced plans to expand his federal law and order campaign already underway to Memphis, to Chicago, and other cities. Let's listen in.
And we're restoring law and order in our country. We're restoring it here, but we're restoring it right now. We're in Memphis. We're going to Chicago. We're going to other cities. Many governors are asking us to, including Democrats are trying to ask. I don't know what the big problem is. If I were a Democrat governor, I'd be saying, whatever you can do to get crime down, I'll take anybody. We've launched a historic campaign to take back our nation from the gangs and the street criminals, violent repeat offenders, illegal alien lawbreakers, domestic extremists, and savage.
However, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker strongly criticized the deployment, calling it an overreach of presidential power that militarizes urban areas. Protests against the National Guard's presence and federal immigration policies continue in Chicago, highlighting the growing tension between the Trump administration and local officials. Now for this discussion, we go back to Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. Now this is ongoing. It started from LA and now it's in Chicago, Illinois. So what are the legal challenges surrounding President Trump's deployment of this Texas National Guard to Chicago?
There's different sections of federal law that would allow, that in theory would allow the President of the United States to deploy National Guard troops domestically. Now, the starting point and what typically gets a lot of attention is that there is a law that generally prohibits the use of the United States military for policing duties within the United States. However, again, there are also sections of federal law that do, in theory, allow the president to deploy the National Guard in situations such as rebellion or other types of domestic unrest. So much of the debate when these cases get into courts, as they have recently, is whether or not the situation on the ground has reached the level as defined under the federal laws that would allow the president to do this. So again, it must be emphasized because there is so much confusion about this. in theory, the president has the right to do this. It's simply a matter of whether or not the facts on the ground reach the level as required by applicable federal law for the president to actually do this. And that's why the other side, whether it's that the city or the state governments are going into court, and they're basically saying, yeah, we have crime, we're not denying that, but the situation on the ground does not rise to the level of unrest or rebellion that would allow the president to take this action. So that's basically what they're debating in the courts. And the judges are coming down differently. It depends whether the judge is a conservative or a progressive. And that's just the reality in the United States. You know, we like to think about judges as being apolitical, but judges have political background. And again, conservative judges will rule in favor of the administration, and progressive or liberal judges will rule against it.
And Ross, is this really necessary, from what you know, to protect these cities, according to President Trump? And we know that there are protests against the ICE commanders and also the National Guard's presence. But will this, just deploying these forces, will this solve problem in long term?
I think the end of your question is really the key. Does it solve a problem, in the long term? Now, the immediate deployment of additional law enforcement or security personnel, that should help reduce crime. Certainly if there are more men and women, possibly with weapons, standing around on street corners, then yeah, it's going to reduce the incidence of street crime where these personnel are deployed. But these deployments are typically for a limited duration, and does it really remedy a problem over the long term? The answer to that is probably no. And that's one of the reasons why the local governments or the state governments are again, they're not denying that there's crime, and they're typically saying that this is not the right solution. The right solution would be provide more money to our local law enforcement agencies, our local police agencies, so we could invest in more equipment, we could hire more personnel, and really work on solving crime over the long term. But part of this, again, is political as well. It makes for good politics for President Trump to say he's taking action, he's taking a demonstrable action to deal with street crime in America's largest cities. And for those who want more law enforcement and those who think that government is not doing enough for crime, then they're very impressed with President Trump's willingness to do this.
With that, I would like to thank Ross Feingold for joining us again and sharing your insight throughout